Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this AHDB Strategic Farm event featuring our Lincolnshire strategic farmer, Chris Elkington. My name is Sarah Pick, and I look after Chris as part of my work in the Knowledge Exchange team in beef and lamb. Tonight's webinar is focusing on sheep lameness, and we have a great lineup of speakers for you tonight. First of all, we have Chris Elkington, who is our strategic farmer, and will be providing us with an introduction to his farm and also an update in a couple of minutes. We also have Dr. Liz Jennifer. She is Chris's consultant and is working with Chris to get the most out of his grass and forage, as well as lots of other things. We also have Rebecca Davenport. Becca is Chris's vet and works for Veterinary Solutions. And finally, we have Hayley Marshall. Hayley is a PhD student at the University of Nottingham, investigating the effectiveness of footbathing. Finally, I'm also joined by my colleague Chloe, who will be our question master for this evening. So before we hear from our speakers, I'm just going to run through the technology so that you know how to ask questions. So if you can't see the question box at the moment, you will need to press the orange arrow button, which essentially is a minimize button. So this one here, if you can see my cursor. So you click on that arrow button and it will expand your toolbar options. Then if you click on the question part and click on the down arrow next to it, you'll be able to see the question box. So you'll type in your question and then remember to press send. Chloe will then read out the questions as they come in. We will have regular question breaks throughout the webinar, so do please keep sending those questions in, and Chloe will make sure she asks them at an appropriate time. And remember, there are no silly questions. So just to check, that's all working okay. Can you write in the question box where you're dialing in from? Brilliant. I can see there's some coming in there. Lovely. So just to run through the agenda for tonight. So as I said, Chris will give us an introduction to his farm and also just chat to us about the lameness that he's experienced this year. We'll then move on to talking about how we can effectively control and prevent lameness, and that's where Becca and Liz will impart their expertise. Hayley will then talk about the results of her PhD, looking at the effectiveness of footbathing. And then Liz will finish off by just talking through the plans on Chris's farm for the next couple of months. We will aim to end the webinar no later than 8:30, so we won't eat into too much of your evening. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Elkington. Chris farms alongside his wife Louise in Grantham, Lincolnshire, and joined the Strategic Farm Programme in 2019. Thanks for joining us tonight, Chris. I know you've done this a number of times, but would you just be able to provide a brief introduction to your farm? So just start with the number of ewes that you have and the systems that you run.
So we run around 550 ewes, including ewe lambs at the minute. With lamb, some of those inside, probably around 175 inside, and then everything else is outdoors in April. The indoor lot starts at the end of this month.
And what breeds are they? The indoor and outdoor flock?
We've got quite a mix of breeds, really. We've got predominantly like a Clin cross Aberfield outdoor lot. We've got some Romneys as well, and some sort of Rouchon mules still kicking about, but sort of heading all towards the sort of Aberfield, Clin cross Aberfield really route. Or we've got some Highlanders as well that we're sort of trialling as well.
Okay, brilliant. And obviously, grassland management has been one of your focus areas as part of being a strategic farm. Can you just describe your current grassland management and maybe just touch a little bit on the herbal ley that you've done as well?
Yeah, so we're quite keen to experiment with herbal leys. So we put one in August. It looks okay. It's probably not come as quite as I'd like, but the plantain and the chicory has come very well. It's the grass that probably hasn't come as well in the mix of it, but I think it'll still be okay. It'll get rotationally grazed along with everything else. We've got enough fencing now to split the farm up into good sized paddocks, and we're going to really sort of go ahead with rotational grazing as much as we can this coming time, along with grass recording as well, measurements.
Brilliant. So are you going to be rotational grazing then ewes and lambs this year?
We will, yeah. We'll probably set stock at lambing, and we'll, as soon as they've probably got to about the 8 weeks, we might even try it a bit earlier if we think we can. But around the 8-week mark, we'll start rotationally grazing them.
Brilliant. And just to point out that herbal ley is a trial with germinal, and I know Liz will touch on it at the end of the webinar. So you did say that you lambed your ewe lambs. How do you find that? I know the last event focused on the ewe lambs. How are they looking now?
They look okay. They look probably as good as we've ever got them, really. I still fear they're probably not big enough. They were on some mustard, and the snow's pretty hindered that, really. It sort of it just flattened it, and it sort of died. So I think they probably stood still a little bit while they're on that, but they don't look too bad. I'm a little bit concerned we still haven't got them big enough, but we're just sort of in the process of getting a plan together and trying to keep them fed, I think, going forward, and certainly feed them after they've lambed.
And what will they weigh, Chris? When you say they're a bit small, what are they?
Well, we haven't weighed them. We haven't weighed them yet. We're going to weigh at scanning, but I would guess they're around the 50-55 kilo mark, somewhere around there. But I'd have liked them a bit bigger, really. But we'll see. I might be pleasantly surprised when we start weighing them.
That's it. And when do you scan them?
Because we took the wool off, you see, so they haven't got the wool on, so they look a bit smaller anyway without the wool. But we scan them about the 17th of Feb, hopefully.
Okay, so if anybody follows Chris on Twitter or Facebook or wherever, look out for those scanning percentages. And you just mentioned that you took the wool off those lambs. Why did you do that?
Well, we left some with the wool on, and we've clipped some as well, just to see really if it did affect growth rates like they sort of said it is. But I possibly don't think it makes a huge amount of difference to growth rates. The main reason really why we do it is because where they lamb, there's some brambles and things like that. And if they're heavy in wool, they get stuck in brambles, and then it's the lambs struggling to find the teat. So we just find it's a good management thing really to keep them clipped in August, and then they're not heavy in wool by the time sort of mid-April comes when they're lambing. Okay.
Brilliant. And just whilst we're on lambing, what were your scanning percentages like for your indoor and outdoor flocks?
So the indoor, I think it was averaged 171. Older ewes were 181. The shearlings were 144. I was a little bit disappointed, but I think actually it was the Romneys that we'd brought in early to tuck them early for the indoor, and I think it's probably my fault. I don't think they suit early lambing, so we'll probably put them into the outdoor flock going forward, and I think they'll be better suited to that. They look very well, and I'm sure they'll be good, but it's just my fault really. I should have had them in the April lot, but overall that wasn't too bad. But the outdoor scanned poorly really. We're 156. Disappointing, but I think we're beginning to know why we're scanning low. I think we haven't been doing ewe lambs well enough. So going forward, we're really going to have to either stop tupping them, or we're going to have to really perfect it and get it right. But hopefully this year will be different.
Yeah, that's it. We'll see what the ewe lambs scan like. And just finally, can you just explain a little bit about Gelston lamb and how that fits in with the farm?
Yeah, so we run sort of a butchery from the sort of, well, we've used nearly all our own lambs this time going forward. We turn it all into sort of meat boxes, or we're now selling individual bits, and people can order what they like, really. We have a weekly delivery round. We have an online web page as well where people can order from, and then we do a weekly delivery route with that, and postal service as well. But going forward, I think this coming time, I think the way we're going, I think everything we produce will be sold through the butchery.
Brilliant.
Going forward.
Brilliant. So it's really picking up pace.
It's been a lifesaver, really. Yeah, it's certainly picking up pace. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Chloe, are there any questions on Chris's system before we move on to lameness?
Yeah, we've just got one quick question, please, Chris. What is the weight of your mature ewes? So just thinking about that relative to the weight of your ewe lambs.
Yeah, they'll be about 70 kilo, around there. Some of the Rouchon mules will be bigger, but we're sort of phasing them out, really, and trying to concentrate on these sort of Innovis breeds.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Is that everything, Chloe?
It is for now, thanks, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So we'll now move on to talking about lameness. So Chris, what lameness incidents did you have this year?
Ewes, we don't really suffer with it, to be quite honest. We run at about a 2%, 3% lameness, I guess. We had a bit of an issue with the shearlings when they first went onto some turnips, where they were a bit sort of lame, probably early stages of foot rot. But again, I think they were in poor condition. They had a bit of they had a very rough time as a ewe lamb in that very wet winter, and I think they just came in poor condition and they've struggled really, and I think they're probably more susceptible when they're struggling. But we had a different problem. We had eye issues, and we were jabbing Alamycin to try and cure the eyes, and it probably cured the feet rather than the eyes. So they're all pretty sound now. But we'll monitor them. Most of them will probably be culled anyway. I think that's probably what's going to happen to those. But apart from that, with generally the older ewes, we don't have a problem really. The only problem we've had a fair bit of scald in our outdoor born lambs. Sort of this time, well, last year and the year before, we sort of suffered with scald quite a lot really with those. So we've been footbathing those to try and cure it.
Brilliant. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But Becca, can I bring you in now? So why is lameness an issue, and what is the cost to flocks?
Yeah, so the main real issue that we do see is the big welfare implications with it. Visibly, you can see that they are in pain and discomfort with any form of lameness, and the severity can be from a mild kind of scald through to your more severe cases of lameness as well. And then it's the knock-on effect on production. Yes, we can see that visible lameness, but how does that affect both the ewe and the ram? We mustn't forget about them as well, as equally important to our sheep industry. But very much, a lame sheep, she's not eating as well as she should do, converting that into a good body condition, and at key times, especially pre-tupping, pre-lambing, that has a knock-on effect then on overall fertility, lamb growth, lamb weights, and how do you quantify that? So as an industry, kind of a value can be put in about 28 million it's affecting or costing over a year, but really that can range, and you know, there's up to kind of 80 million that we are seeing, and that's through losses that you can't quite monitor or put a value on, and I think one of those in particular is the labour and the time intensity of treating those, that sometimes we don't value as much as we should, and in tackling lameness as an issue, really.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right there. So what are the targets then you should be working towards in a flock? I know Chris earlier said that he'll have about 3% lameness instance in his flock. Is that good? Is that bad? What would we be aiming for?
That is good. Yeah, really, we're looking for that 2% really lameness across your flock. But we do have a lot that are running kind of 5-10%. And with those, you just get such variable costs then, you know, for some kind of running at 5%, there's figures it's kind of £3.90 per ewe kind of cost for treatments, up to when you're running at 10%, then you're kind of looking up to your £6 even more. You know, some cases of people spending significant amounts on those sheep, but equally cutting their productivity or life short because of that lameness. You know, it's a cold decision, unfortunately, and so you're losing out on further years for that. So really we are trying or aiming as an industry for less than 2%, but it is a big it's a difficult problem to tackle, really, and it's one that unfortunately, you know, it will take time to reduce those. And I think for everyone, it's not to feel that they've got to get there straight away, but it's how to get there in an achievable fashion that's going to be beneficial for your business, as well as the welfare of the sheep too.
Yeah. And I know Chris mentioned that he had some scald and some foot rot this year. What are the other main diseases that we should be looking for within lameness?
Yeah, so foot rot really is the main one that we do see. About 40% of lamenesses is identified as foot rot. Scald again as well, similar numbers, slightly less with those, but more commonly seen, or more so seen in our lambs. Cod is another one that is usually more from bought-in sheep, that we do see an issue with those, often affecting kind of 1 foot, but does spread quite quickly through the flocks. And I think if anybody has had it or seen it, it is quite devastating and quite a difficult disease, unfortunately, to manage. And then there's things like shelly hoof, toe granulomas, sometimes a bit more traumatic events that leads to lameness as well. So yeah, foot rot really is quite high up there as one of the main causes of lameness, unfortunately.
And Chris, then going back to your flock, what do you think was the main cause of that foot rot in that shearling group?
I think really it was just, I think they were probably just in poor condition, and I think it was just a bit wet on the ground when they went on, and because the older ewes didn't struggle with it. So I just think it was the fact that they were probably under stress anyway, and a bit of, you know, just a bit wet going. Sort of,
yeah. And Liz and Becca, is there any research out there to suggest that if ewes are in poorer condition, they are more susceptible to lameness?
I think with anything, yeah, poor condition, then, you know, not in as fitter selves as they could be, and it's like us really, if we're not as well as we should be, our immunity is weakened, more susceptible to infections. With foot rot, the bacteria that affects that can just live, you know, quite naturally on sheep, on carriers that have it, and it does need that trauma to that foot in order for the bacteria to get in and cause an infection. So very much, you know, kind of poor condition can be an effect of that. But I think, like Chris said, unfortunately, elements, the weather, stocking densities, mixing groups, those sorts of things have kind of significant impacts as well.
Yeah. And Chris, how did you go about treating those shearlings? I know you said they had eye problems as well, is that right?
Yeah, we've had a terrible time with eyes. We're just in that group outside on the turnips. So obviously I knew that some were lame and they were going to get treated, but we were jabbing Alamycin for the eyes, and I just think the Alamycin cured the feet. and sort of help us with their eyes as well. But I think that's what happened with it. So we haven't been back and treated them specifically. You know, you could say we did, I guess, but you know, that's what happened basically. So they have had a jab of Alleimycin.
So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. Becca, is that recommended to go in with the antibiotics?
Yeah, I think it's assessing the foot is really important. Definitely from evidence, the sooner you can get on top of a lame sheep, then it's much better prognosis for it recovering and improving. So it's definitely an element we do want to do. Depends on the severity. So scald often responds just to topical treatment, but your foot rot often involves an injectable antibiotics, and Alleimycin is kind of first line for those cases. Definitely, if they're struggling to respond or you're having repeat incidences, then, you know, further investigation, discussing with your vet. Pictures, great with our phones now, just to be able to ping over, have a look, just makes it a little bit better for us all to know kind of what's going on. And I think definitely for those, it's just not to ignore the cases that aren't responding to your first line treatment, but then it's also combining, you know, the other aspects of which I think we're discussing a bit anyway, of managing your lameness. Sometimes having to isolate them or run a lame group is really important to minimize the transfer of infection. Looking at where they are, is there any other pressures that are creating more impact for them too? But definitely first line for your foot rot, would you find in general respond well to that treatment?
Okay, thank you. And Chris, going back to those lambs that had scald, how did you treat them?
We just ran them through a foot bath, formalin-based foot bath. So every time they were in the shed, we ran them through, and then we'd leave them in the shed for sort of half an hour to sort of dry off, and then back out again. And we probably treated them. We were treating them more than I'd like, really. They were quite bad with it. So not all of them, but enough of them to be of concern. And yeah, I think we probably treated them 4 or 5 times, something like that, to get it over, to get off of it. But we probably haven't got enough sheep on the job. The grass gets probably a bit too long, and it goes a bit stalky, and I think that's where the issue comes from with the lambs. It's sort of long, stalky grass rubbing through the cleats, and I think that's probably the issue of it.
Yeah, so once we hopefully perfect that rotational grazing, that issue might be reduced.
Yeah, I think that will help. I think that'll help, definitely. I think if we could just keep on top of our grass and keep it managed at a shorter level, then I think that will definitely help. Yeah.
And Becca, is there a relationship then between foot rot in your ewes and scald in your lambs?
Yeah, so more evidence is showing that it's the same bacteria that starts off with your scald and then transfers or develops into your foot rot. So if you've got that infection and there's a sheep that's carrying that, then that bacteria is going to be on their foot, and it can survive in the environment for 7 to 10 days. So areas that has a high footfall, so sometimes just your gateways around any lick buckets, water troughs, those sorts of things, any creep feeders, then that's going to be kind of your high risk areas that they survive, and then more animals will come to. And again, you know, like Chris was saying, if your pasture's sometimes just a bit stalky, or things like thistles cause a damage, then that will give them an entry point for that bacteria to get in. So unfortunately, at times it can be a bit of a vicious cycle that you are battling with, but often can go hand in hand, I'm afraid.
And is this where vaccination would come in then with the foot vax? I mean, I know, Chris, this year you were umming and ahhing about using it, weren't you? And in the end, you didn't decide to use it. Why was that?
No, we haven't used, because Liz told me not to. That was simple.
So Liz, why did you tell him not to?
I think because vaccination is really important, and it's an important part of the 5-point plan. But the challenge back I gave to Chris was I'm not sure he was doing the other bits of the 5-point plan. So without, do you mean there was sort of more getting on top of it with that. We could get on top of it with antibiotics, as he has now done, without needing to use the foot vax. So foot vax to me is once you've sort of not quite exhausted everything else, but once you've ticked off quite a lot of the other things and it's still not sort of helping, is then you potentially going with foot vax in this situation. I mean, it can be used preventative if they're putting into a shed and things like that, but I just didn't feel it was quite the right thing to do.
Yeah, just out of interest, Chloe, can you just load the poll? So we've got a poll on who has actually used footvax this year. If you could complete that, that would be great. And Chloe, would you be able to read out the results for us?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just give everybody a minute.
And I suppose, Chris, you have used it before, haven't you? You have
yeah,
used
we have
vax.
used it in the past. Yeah, we used to use it probably every year, and then I started to realise that we probably didn't need to do that, and we haven't used it for quite some number of years now. I think we probably haven't used it for a good 4 years now, and we haven't really got a problem. So, like you say, I think I just sort of panicked a little bit and thought, well, they're lame, and then I got sidetracked with their eyes, so it took my mind off it, and we ended up jabbing them with Valamycin, and it sorted the problem out. So, yeah, I think it's something that's a great tool probably, but like you say, it's a 5-point plan that we need to sort of do before we leap into using it.
That's it. And has that poll come in, Chloe? The results come in?
69% of our listeners this evening don't use footvax and 31% are using it.
Right. And Becca, would that be quite common, that result? Only about a third are using the footvax.
Yeah, we've got quite a lot of, I suppose our clients are using it, but I think just as Liz and Chris have said, I think it's got to be used in combination with all other aspects of the 5-point plan. I think especially vaccines, and as we're seeing kind of in our own COVID world at the moment, it's a brilliant tool, but it's not the be all and end all. And I think some people feel the vaccine will solve everything, and then they don't need to worry about all other aspects. So I think that's where a lot of it comes down to. It's using it in conjunction with all other points in order to get on and tackle the lameness problem. Definitely with clients you chat to that have had a really bad problem and probably running at your 10% and culling quite hard and losing a lot of stock, the vaccine has really helped and been a great benefit in order to keep kind of reproduction levels up and you know, managing their costs as an industry, definitely not wanting to rely heavily on antibiotics, and for cases that aren't responding as well, the vaccines helped to improve those too. I think the counter to that is it is just quite a nasty vaccine to handle, to inject, and does cause large lumps kind of on the side of the neck, which can last for a long period. So on that basis, I think it is one that people might be a bit more tentative to use, really.
Yeah, and is there an ideal time to administer that vaccine to make it most effective?
It's really variable, and I would say more it is farm to farm kind of variation that we do see. And I think that's the other thing, is that each farm is different, each lameness problem is different, so finding one that fits all isn't always the easiest sort of say. I generally tend, for people starting out using it, is to look at risk periods, so that can be pre-tupping, so when you're mixing different groups together, so you're trying to minimize the spread between those. In general, it lasts kind of 5-6 months, so that would then take you over your next risk period, which is often housing for lambing, and takes you through to the summertime when you'd be turning out again. But there are various different options and different ways you can use it as a one-off. If you've got a really bad problem, then you can use it as a vaccine regime and give 2 injections 6 weeks apart. Key times to be careful is pre and post lambing, so you don't really want to use it 4 to 6 weeks really before then. And about 6 weeks pre-shearing, you want to be careful, mainly because of the lumps at that time time period as well. So there are set windows that are a bit trickier to use it too.
Brilliant, thank you. And you've just touched on the 5-point plan there. Would you be able to just explain the other topics on that?
Yeah, so vaccination, as we've mentioned, is one of them. Quarantine is another. So as I mentioned earlier, cod is an infectious lameness problem in our sheep. And if any of you have experienced it, most commonly it comes from bought-in sheep. So the next point on the 5-point plan would be quarantine, and really looking, if we can, which I know is hard, to keep any new livestock isolated for 28 days away from your current flock, ideally kind of in barn space or field space that you're not going to use subsequently, and kind of have that as your isolation area. It gives you that time point then to monitor for lameness as well as other diseases, sheep scab, that sort of thing, and to work through a quarantine protocol to manage those. So that's one massive aspect which I think unfortunately is quite hard to do in the realistic kind of farming calendar, buying in, you know, kind of replacements. Often you're wanting to just get them ready to go to tupping, but if we can look to factor that in, I think then that can solve or minimise quite a lot of issues that crop up a bit later down the line.
Because I know, Chris, you bought in a tup this year that you think might have come in with foot rot. Did you isolate him?
Yeah, he was isolated. Probably not long enough, if I'm brutally honest, but he was isolated a couple of weeks. Yeah, he was fine when he came, and then he was lame on his back end when we were tupping, and he's lame again on the back end now, and it is a bit of foot rot, but that's a bit disappointing.
And ideally, how long should you quarantine them then, Becca, when they come in?
Ideally 28 days, so, but that is hard. I didn't do that for my tup, and we got away with it. So
some are lucky, some are unlucky.
I know.
And sometimes it's also about inspection, particularly for CODD, is looking at it and turning and looking, and you'll see between. So they're just keeping them separate for 28 days, but it's also in an ideal world. But in reality, what people could do if they need to make that shorter is just do more of an inspection of each foot even, to see what's going on.
Yeah. Okay.
I think, and it's this, and the key thing with all lameness is wherever possible is to remove those lame sheep from that group. Think of it as an infectious disease, and you're just trying to you're trying to stop the spread within that group. But I appreciate some of the time it's not possible.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So Becca, we've touched on quarantine and we've touched on vaccination. What are the other 3 points?
Treatment's the other one, so we mentioned a little bit earlier, prompt treatment, and yeah, a bit more evidence showing if you can treat within kind of 3 days or as soon as you identify it, better success rate and outcome to that treatment. I think that's where it's good chatting with your vet, just trying to get pictures, showing them, seeing what sort of lesions. Is it scald? Is it foot rot? Is it cod? Just trying to work out the best treatment plan kind of for everyone. And then, as Liz said, you know, isolating. Quite a lot of flocks run your kind of lame ewes as a separate group, trying to keep them, you know, away, especially kind of through tupping and lambing, or at lambing time as you're housing, trying to identify those and try and keep them separate too. It just does get hard when you've got your other management regimes, especially kind of feeding pre-lambing, but all of those aspects would be really good just to try and minimise the spread from sheep to sheep, really. The other one's trying to avoid, so as we mentioned as well, just kind of those areas, kind of muddy areas around your water troughs, lick buckets, those sorts of things. Really good biosecurity, so kind of movement on and off, your own disinfection, so if you're going through sheep, you're turning, you're looking, trying to be really good with your trimmers or although we're not trimming too much. But
Yeah.
gloves are really, really good, that sort of thing. And just trying to be careful, you know, if you are touching something infectious, just trying then not to go on to the next one and spreading that around in that way. Disinfection, that sort of thing too.
And is there particular disinfectants that we should be using if we've got a problem with lameness?
Generally it responds to all disinfection types, so we use FAM 30 as vets. That's our really good one. That's a very good DEFRA assured one, especially for your TB and those sorts of diseases, so that's kind of my go-to. Things like lime, equally quite good, just to dry out areas and help with disinfection along those ways. So in that essence, it's generally is killed by those ones as well. And then the final point would be looking at your culling, really. So each farm does or can have different cull policies. Some places have one strike and you're out. Others are a bit more 2, 3, but that sort of monitoring and recording, really, to see, are those the repeat offenders, those that are just not responding or recurring, and really those are the ones that we do worry about. They're going to keep reinfecting and risk of spreading to others, so having a cull policy for those also helps to minimise the disease spreading.
And Chris, do you cull your lame sheep then?
Yes, yeah, we cull them. Anything that's persistently lame will be culled. Yeah,
so
really.
So do you record that then? Do you use your data? You've got a very good data system.
We use the reader. If something's persistently lame, it'll get marked down on the reader that it's being persistently lame, and then sort of after, if she's rearing a lamb, you know, at that time of weaning or whatever, she'll just be pulled off into the culls, and that'll be that. Yeah, we're fairly strict on sorting out any sort of problems that arises like that, foot rot, mastitis. They don't get many chances, really. But I'll just touch on the trimming as well. We haven't trimmed the foot for I would say probably 5 or 6 years. I do trim the tucks because they just get a bit bad. I think just because they're so big and heavy, I don't think the feet are great anyway. But we do trim them. But that's it. None of the ewes have any trimming done at all. And I think we've probably seen fewer cases with not touching their feet.
And Becca, why is foot trimming not advised?
Yeah, it's a hard one because I think previously we'd always kind of chop back if we get there, open up the infection. That was always the thoughts, but so much more is showing that actually damages the hoof and the horn kind of surrounding that area even more now, making it a lot harder, and leaving it alone. Actually, the sheep is very good at then fighting that infection and allowing the horn to kind of grow back over. It is a hard concept, but it is one that we're really recommending, especially any that are infected, to not trim. And I think that was also a mainstay of kind of the transmission, really. You know, regular routine trimming, you'd move from one to the next, and unfortunately spread it in that fashion as well.
Yeah. Okay, and I know, Chris, your lameness incidence is quite good at 3%, but to get it to that golden 2%, Becca, what do you advise that Chris does differently this year?
Yeah, I think that's it. It's definitely a really good level of where it is. And I think his cull policy is really good. I think, like we touched on, the quarantine, that would be one aspect that I think just need to look at timings, but I do appreciate that is hard, especially kind of with systems and trying to kind of factor everything else in that's going on the farm, but especially with a closed flock and you know, breeding your ewe lambs, you're kind of minimizing all other ways of spreading it. Looking at your risk field, so if the shearlings had a bad time in that particular area? Is there a reason why, you know, over the winter, is that somewhere that you'd kind of hold back from next time? So trying to avoid that infection area, and just reviewing that incidence. And like we're saying, just footbacks can be beneficial if we know that there's going to be a problem area, but I think minimal kind of indication for that at this time point, really.
Yeah. Okay.
I think
And
possibly with shearlings, sorry, Sarah,
no,
I think
go on,
possibly what
Chris.
the shearlings struggled was, as a ewe lamb, they were down on some very long grass. We didn't have enough down there to keep under control at all, and I mean it was extremely high grass, and they were quite lame down there as a young ewe lamb. I think that probably didn't help at all with them. So they would have been suffering with scald, and they were off farm, and I don't think that helped at all. So it's probably caused the foot rot issue as a shearling.
Yeah. And is that likely then, that if they get it as a lamb, they're much more likely to get it as a shearling?
It's oh, sorry.
No, go for it, Liz.
No, just sometimes if they've had an infection and it's changed the shape of the foot, it can sometimes act as a bit of a reservoir of where that bacteria can sort of be maintained on the foot, but then it needs a trigger to then go into disease.
Right.
So it can sort of, it's not necessarily, it's to do with the foot shape that is one of the risk factors. But again, until we look at the feet, we don't know whether that's a factor. But certainly those sort of persistently lame sheep are acting as a really nice reservoir for that bacteria to go to other sheep.
Thank you. And Becca, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, very much the same, really. Just that impact kind of on development, and then being a reservoir, really, for transmission.
Yeah. And just a final question I had was on the foot vax. Is it advisable to give it now to heavy in lamb ewes, or are you better waiting?
Yeah, I think that is an element that I do worry about, and I think that's something that is best to discuss, kind of the risk benefit with your vets and each farm's different situation. As I say, kind of not to be given kind of closer than 4 weeks pre-lambing, and really you shouldn't give with any other vaccination and needs to be 2 weeks apart from those. So it is a bit of a juggling act to find the right time. My first line is kind of pre-tupping, really, less risk to the ewe, to the lambs, and then you're protecting them for that risk period of mixing groups, tupping, and then at housing, say, if that's the occurrence, and then looking possibly to do it a bit later on in the season if needs be. So yeah, it's definitely one that I think needs to be discussed, just with it kind of putting a sheep through anything. You can give it is licensed, but I think there's just a part of me that'd be a bit hesitant at this time, just with the current situation of the ewe's condition.
That's it, you don't want to upset a deer too much at that critical stage. Lovely. Well, thank you all very much. Chloe, have we got any questions for our speakers?
Yes, we've got lots of questions. So
brilliant.
Plenty now. There's a couple I'll just leave towards the end, but yeah. The first one is for you, Becca. When calculating lameness percentage, are you looking at the number treated in a year, or is it the number lame at any one time?
Yeah, I think that is a hard thing, and in general, kind of looking over a year basis, basically, at those. And I suppose it is, how do you quantify it? So is that by looking at them, or is that by treatment? In general, I'd be saying kind of numbers that you have had to treat for lameness would indicate that it's severe enough in that element. But again, I think that's building the data up farm to farm. You can kind of decide how you want to monitor it and manage it on that basis, and then if you follow that through each year, then that helps to be that guidance.
Great, thank you. And Chris, what age were your lambs when they had scald, and did it develop into foot rot in any of those lambs?
They would be around about the 6-7 months, about that sort of age. No, it hasn't. Once we got on top of it, they were fine. We've not had any foot rot problems in the lambs.
Brilliant, thank you. And Liz, we've got a question here for you. Does quality of foot structure in ewes have any beneficial effects against infectious diseases? And is it worth selecting tups on foot structure as a selection criteria?
Yeah, it's like any of those sort of structural traits. There'll be a bit of genetics and a bit of environment, but certainly some people would, and I suppose why culling and keeping replacements from sheep that haven't been lame. So you are trying to sort of help the population be a bit more or less susceptible to foot rot. I think sometimes tups, I think as Chris mentioned, they're putting quite a lot of weight on their feet. My theory, I'm sure I read it somewhere, but it might be just my theory, which is also the testosterone that as it increases also makes them more susceptible to infection. It affects their immunity a bit. So I think in most places rams are probably more lame than anything and get more treatments for lameness from antibiotics than most other things. So I think there is something about trying to select for sheep that are less susceptible to lameness, and that involves record keeping, buying from breeders who are doing work on that. There has been a bit of work happen, well, certainly in Scotland and New Zealand, scoring feet from a genetic evaluation perspective. So there are techniques out there for people who want to score feet for sort of reducing lameness.
Great, thanks, Liz. And Becca, a similar question for you. For people that are struggling with this at the front of the foot and the cavity and stones and whatnot, working the way up the foot that possibly starts as lambs. Any suggestions to course of action dealing with that?
Oh, it is really tricky, especially if it's the ground that they're on that's kind of causing that trauma. So that's just the balance really of looking possibly at your pasture management. What are the lambs going on nutritional wise? Sometimes with lambs that are, say, creep fed, that weakens or can alter the foot, and so they can be more susceptible there. So it is trying to look at the whole big picture, and not just the lamb itself, but what are they on, and what's the kind of nutrition status as well. I don't think I've got quite a full answer for that, I'm afraid.
Thank you. We've got 2 comments here on the use of Alamycin. So is Alamycin better than Betamox, and would you prefer Alamycin over Ultrapen LA? Do you have any comments on that?
Personally, yeah, oxytetracyclines, which is in your Alamycin, have been shown to be more effective for your foot rot. Each farm can vary though, and I think that is really good or important to be having a discussion with your own vets for your situation. The key thing is a long-acting antibiotic really. Some of the short-acting penicillins, you have to give repeat injections, and that's not always feasible, so I do prefer those, but it can be case by case. But Alamycin is my first line for your foot rot.
Thank you. And do you have any thoughts on the use of topical sprays as well?
Yeah, I think they're really beneficial. I think to target it from both areas, especially your foot rot. I think we're seeing good responses to your topical as well as your injectable. I think the hard thing is often kind of what are they going back out onto after you've treated. Ideally, it's giving it time to dry into that area, to penetrate and to work, that makes them more effective. The hard thing is often it's out in a muddy field or back out to a muddy field, and so you are limited with those aspects as well, but do find that the topical can help definitely. Also anti-inflammatories, so your Metacam, and that can really help just improve and help sheep get over the lameness quicker, back to kind of a better form too.
Yeah, and just on one top tip similar to that, which is it was actually Joe Angel who did quite a lot of work on the CODD. So and his technique with the topical was to spray it once, let it dry and spray it again. So it is about getting it to dry on the foot, and as Becca said, not to get it then washed off as soon as they go out onto pasture. But it's that sort of it provides some sort of immediate attack, doesn't it, of that on the foot.
Brilliant, thanks Liz. And another one for you here. What's the ideal height of grass to reduce scald?
Oh, excellent question. I'm not sure I can answer it. So yeah, the challenge we love sward heights anywhere between 4 and 8 centimetres is where optimum sort of sheep production should be. The idea of a lawn that just needs cutting. The challenge is what helps grass, which is that sort of moist days, not as moist as it is currently, but is also helping maintain that bacteria population. So we've spoken a bit about stalky stuff. So certainly if it's sort of anywhere between 4 and 8, you keep it in this vegetative state. But as we know, that isn't always possible, but we're trying to keep it certainly below 8 centimetres for ewes and lambs.
Great, thanks. And Becca, how about foot abscesses? How do we treat those?
Yeah, similarly, to kind of an injectable antibiotics, probably for your abscesses more the penicillin base, so your Betamox or your Ultrapen are a bit better for those. I always think white white pus, white injectable, but similarly kind of topical spray over the top, depends where the abscess is or if there's a cause for it as well, but sometimes that can be a bit more effective than the Alamycin. It is hard because you're often trying to assess and see what is the infection, so I think, yeah, good inspections are important to work out what is going on.
Thank you. A final one for now is, if you're using footback, should you do it annually or is it more of a one-off thing?
Really, I would say annually, and like I say, it's just trying to target your risk period for your farm. So often, like I was saying, pre-tupping is the time that they utilise it the most, really, and especially for any kind of bought-in livestock coming onto the farm. And if you've had foot rot as a problem, they're going to either be naive to it, so you want to make sure that they are protected and as low risk of kind of becoming infected as possible, but then you can increase the instance you do use it, just depending on the severity of lameness with that as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll come back to the rest in a short while.
Brilliant, thank you, Chloe, and thank you to everybody for sending in your questions. Keep them coming. So it's my pleasure to now hand over to Hayley Marshall, who is currently undertaking a PhD looking at the effectiveness of foot bathing. And I know, Chris, you mentioned that it was the way that you treated those lambs with scald. So we really look forward to hearing your preliminary results.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll share my screen.
Your desktop did flag up and then it's just disappeared.
Okay. So can you see that now?
I can't.
Okay. Let me try again, 1 second.
That's no problem. That's it. We're up and
Let
running.
me just try and move everyone out of the way. So
I was just about to break out into song then for a minute.
Phil. What were you going to sing, Chris?
Luckily, it didn't come to that.
Brilliant. Are you good to go, Hayley?
I am, yes. Okay,
Lovely.
so yeah,
Thanks very
today
much.
I'm going to talk a little bit about a project I've been involved in that's looking at the use of foot baths as a preventative and a control for lameness, which has been funded by AHDB. So today I'm going to focus on two key areas. The first is frequency and around footbath protocols, so how frequent are footbaths being used and what impact that has on the bacterial community. And then secondly, I'm going to look at footbath and hoof contamination and what impact that has on bacterial survival within the footbath itself. So we've already heard actually, but the two most common causes of lameness in the UK are foot rot, which manifests from interdigital dermatitis or scald, and contagious ovine digital dermatitis or COD. And both of these are caused by bacterial infection. And although these infections are polymicrobial, which means they're associated with a number of different bacteria, but their main causative bacteria for each disease is, so for ID and foot rot, the main bacteria is Dichelobacter nodosus, and for COD, the main bacteria is thought to be Treponema. And ultimately, this means that we need to use antibiotics to treat these bacterial infections. So the current best practice is to treat as soon as possible and to separate them from the rest of the flock. And as I said, these diseases are contagious. So by removing them from the rest of the flock, this helps us reduce passing the bacteria from one individual to another, which means in the future you would need to use less antibiotics as you protected the rest of the flock from the outbreak of the bacteria. So what does this mean for the industry? Well, a recent study of 24 commercial flocks found that lameness accounted for actually more than 65% of their bacterial use, which is represented by this big blue block here. And so we wanted to look at foot baths, and because we're so aware of kind of antimicrobial resistance, we wanted to see, do foot baths have a preventative role to play in reducing the need for using antibiotics in the first place? Okay, so I just first want to show you some of the results from a questionnaire that I sent out to farmers. And this is how I kind of shaped what I would then go on to investigate during my project. So the questionnaire was from the time point 2017 and 2018. And 127 participants gave me usable answers where they told me their lameness, number of animals they treated, and how they controlled these levels of lameness. So as you can see from the, map, the farms that did use footbath are represented by a red dot, and this represented 63% of the farmers that responded. And this is quite consistent with other previous questionnaires that found around sort of 58 to 60% of farmers used footbaths. And now I didn't want to kind of bombard you with slide after slide of all the results from the questionnaire, but I just wanted to pull out some of the key points. So what chemical are farmers tending to use? And that's formalin. Most farmers were using that, and they was using this as a walkthrough. And those that said that they used zinc sulfate tended to say that they used that as a standing foot bath, which means that we're following the guidelines on the bottle. Then we went on to see when they're actually using these, and the majority of farmers, so 74%, said that they used foot baths when they had a particular lameness problem, and so they was using them more of a kind of a treatment rather than a prevention. And then quite interestingly, 64% of farmers said that they used them as a one-off treatment after a gathering. And so we wanted to investigate this a little bit further later on, and I'll show you the results of that. And then those that did house for lambing, for example, a third of those used foot bathing either before or during the lambing, during the housing, sorry, and they use this either on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. So again, I will show you a few of the results from that later on as well. So as we're looking at the role of foot baths as a preventative, I wanted to investigate this single use of foot bath after a gathering and what impact this has on the actual bacterial community of the sheep's hoof. So we selected 6 healthy ewes, and we swabbed the individual in between the hoof, across 11 time points. So it was 3 time points before the foot bath and 8 time points after a foot bath. And we used 2% glutathione for this. And why did we use glutathione? Well, it was for a couple of different reasons, really. So practical reasons, after doing the questionnaire and talking to farmers, they prefer to use a walk-through foot bath, and glutathione is a walk-through foot bath. Why didn't we use formalin? Well, formalin is a carcinogen, so we wanted to kind of move away from using formalin. And a Swedish study using post-slaughter samples found that glutathione performed equally to that of formalin, so we thought it was quite a good substitute to formalin. The next reason was around antimicrobial resistance. So some of the other foot baths, such as zinc and copper, are heavy metals, and they're sometimes associated with antimicrobial resistance and kind of co-selection with antibiotics. So we also wanted to try and stay away from them. And kind of related to antimicrobial resistance, but glutathione is also more environmentally friendly. So a lot of the time farmers would empty the foot bath and tip it onto the land or tip it down the drain. And if you're using, for example, a heavy metal, these metals stay in the environment for a long time. And so glutathione actually naturally biodegrades. So it was more of an environmentally friendly foot bath. So what were the results? So we looked at the bacterial community in 2 different ways. First, we tried to just grow aerobic bacteria on plates. So the dotted line represents the application of the foot bath. And as you can see, immediately after the foot bath, the foot bath killed the bacteria. And you can see this from the plate. We couldn't grow nearly as much bacteria straight after the foot bath. But within 24 hours, that bacteria recovered. And so the foot bath had a really short-lived impact on the general bacterial community. Then we also wanted to look more closely at Dichelobacter nodosa, which I said is associated with ID and foot rot. And as you can see, immediately after the foot bath, as the foot bath has killed all the aerobic bacteria, it's allowed the denodosis to kind of maintain and stay on the skin. And it actually took up to 7 days for the Dichelobacter nodosa to reduce in population, and that was not necessarily the Dichelobacter nodosa rapidly growing, but it was more the recovery of the other bacteria. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the foot bath had a detrimental impact on the bacteria population. It was really a short-lived impact, and maybe questions whether we need to use this one-off treatment with foot bath at all. And this is actually reflected in the current literature. So some of the retrospective observational studies have found that foot baths don't have particularly a negative impact on lameness levels, but they also don't have a detrimental impact on lameness levels. Then we wanted to go on to investigate this repeated foot bath. So when farmers were bringing they're using for housing in the preparation of lamine. So some of the farmers were using it either monthly or weekly, and we wanted to investigate that a little bit more. So this time I was working on a commercial farm. We had 500 breeding ewes, and they brought their ewes in 9 weeks before lambing, and they were also foot bathing 3 weeks before they brought them into housing, and they were foot bathing once a week. So this time, so we had one half of the shed that was being foot bathed once a week, and the other half that was being foot bathed twice a week. And this is just an example of their shed. And so we tried to split it as evenly possible. So for example, this was some singles, and also this was singles. So we tried to have an even number in each group of singles and twins. We did not swab any of the triplets, because we didn't obviously want to mess around with them too much. Now this particular farm had in the past a mixed disease status of cod and foot rot, so they had quite a bad outbreak of cod a few years before, and they still had the odd case now. So these are the results. So the single foot bath is represented by the open symbol. And as you can see, when we apply it once a week, we don't really see an impact to that foot bath. The bacteria, the Dichelobacter maintains a similar level throughout the whole 5 weeks. And when we apply it twice a week, we have a little bit more variation, but again, there's no significant difference between the two groups. So it would argue that there is no real reason for foot bathing more than once a week. And then, as I mentioned, this particular farm had a problem with cod. So we also looked at the Treponema species. And again, we had no difference between the two groups in particular. They both slightly increased over time. And when we applied the foot bath twice, it seemed to increase slightly more with the twice weekly foot bath group. But again, we didn't see a difference between the two regimes, so it would suggest that foot bathing twice a week was no more beneficial. And this also was representative in their lameness scores. So I also lameness scored not just the ones that I could swab, but the entire 500 flock, and lameness just steadily increased over time. So it may suggest that the foot bath had no real impact on lameness. The next thing we wanted to look at was actually hoof contamination and foot bath survival directly from the foot bath. So as we were passing the sheep through the foot bath, as each pen went through, I ran over and swabbed the foot bath to see if I could grow bacteria direct from the foot bath. And as you can see, I could grow some bacteria, but it was doing its job, so I wasn't able to grow very much bacteria. If you remember back the other slide, bacteria from the sheep's foot, this plate was completely covered in bacteria. So the foot bath is doing its job, but we also wanted to see if I was able to recover any Dichelobacter nodosus. So I did try, this is hoof agar. So it contains some particles of hoof, and I was able to grow some Dichelobacter nodosus from the foot bath, which suggests that maybe the foot bath isn't killing the Dichelobacter nodosus quite as sufficiently. And it may suggest that if you do have individuals that have got signs of disease, maybe put them right to the back and wash the clean ones first before you would pass through any that have disease. So the key findings from my studies is that foot bath does not seem to have a long-term positive impact on the bacterial community. And it would argue that actually a one-off treatment of a foot bath is potentially not needed and is maybe wastes time. If you are going to use foot bathing, I would always separate any lame ones and run them through last. Finally, foot bathing isn't effective at treating adult ewes. So I would say continue treating individuals if they have clinical cases, because yeah, the foot bath really cannot treat an adult ewe with foot rot or cod. It stays with it for many weeks. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for AHDB for funding, my supervisors and everyone that helped with swabbing, and all the farmers that participated. It was they were amazing. Okay.
Thanks, Hayley. That was brilliant. So you haven't completed your report yet, have you?
No, I haven't, no.
So it'll be available probably the middle of this year, middle to end of this year.
Yes, I would say so, yeah.
The full report. So yeah, so we're getting in there early to see what Hayley's found. So thank you very much. Chloe, are there any questions for Hayley?
Yes, we've got a couple. The first one was if people are foot vaccine, do you have any tips and tricks for foot vaccine in the field?
Oh gosh. We never used foot bathing in the field. So I wouldn't necessarily have any tips, but it would be just to have a really good handling system in place, because you want to make sure that they kind of go through nice and slowly. So occasionally we found, so on one farm, we unfortunately had some workers overhead, and trying to push the sheep through the footbath was interesting, and it also meant that at the end there was hardly any solution left in, so it just really set it up nicely so that when they're walking through nice and slowly, don't rush them.
Becca and Liz, do you have any answers for that question?
But I think we've also been, we've got to be quite aware that Hayley has just suggested it doesn't work. So just point out there. But I think it's just so it's seeing whether that's the most effective treatment you can do, or whether it is treating individual lame ones, or it could be that you're trying to treat a group of lambs with some scald, and the work that Hayley's done hasn't proved that it works or doesn't work in that group. But certainly the big one is actually, is it the right group of sheep? Is it the right treatment? Do I need to do something else? And
thanks, Liz, for getting straight to the point there.
Yeah.
And Becca, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think it's just really interesting results, really, and I think definitely, like Liz said, just got to review actually, is it the right thing for that group treatment wise. I can't say I enjoy foot bathing as an experience, and it isn't fun out in the fields. It'll be really interesting to see kind of the effect on lambs, and whether that is still a suitable treatment for them, really. So I think that would be a great next step, but I think it's definitely making us thinking a bit more, is it the right treatment option?
That's what I was going to sort of say. It would be really interesting to see it, how it sort of does with the scald in lambs, and whether it's a waste of time, or does it actually do some good. So that would be an interesting thing. We do use a mat, or I have been using wool, rightly or wrongly, in ours when we're running sheep through, because sometimes they do tend to rush when they see it, and they run through as fast as they can. We tend to put some wool or a foam mat in, just to try and keep that water in the trough a bit more and stop the splash, especially using formalin. It's rotten stuff, and if I can get away without foot bathing, then that would be a good thing. Certainly using formalin. So if it is a waste of time, then we need to know.
Thanks, everyone. I think that's answered quite a lot of questions, actually, because we've had quite a few about specific conditions. If people are still continuing to use it for scald, how regularly would you recommend it's done? And, could it be harmful to foot bath too often?
I think it could definitely be harmful to foot bath too often. So we see that if you are applying any, for example, formalin over 3%, that is definitely harmful to the sheep's skin, and then can cause more problems than not, because it can damage the skin and then let the bacteria in. But no, I'm sorry, I don't know with scald how often it should be used in lambs. I can't answer that question, sorry.
But I think it's also, I suppose, trying to intervene before it gets to a high level in lambs, and then so individual treatment with a topical spray it's not a massive, well, it's still a massive job, but it's trying to intervene early enough. So that is one way of doing it, rather than having to run everything through a foot bath, and may or not work.
Thanks, both. And another foot bathing one. Again, if people are using a foot bath, do you recommend a traditional foot bath or a mat?
So from my questionnaire data, I asked farmers if they was using a walkthrough or a mat, and unfortunately I didn't have enough farmers that said that they were using mats to properly calculate if it had an impact on their treatment levels. So I haven't personally used a mat, but as I say, from the questionnaire data, we also wasn't able to pull out if that's more beneficial or not.
Thank you. We've got a question here, might be one for you, Becca. Have you come across copper sulfate or iodine for lameness? Does it work?
Yeah, copper sulfate is used kind of in as one of your foot baths as well, and then I think there's a bit more topical application. I haven't personally used it myself or recommended it. I usually go for the topical antibiotic sprays. So you know, iodine, it's a disinfectant, so to some degree that will help to remove kind of infections on there. The only thing is, I think it's quite well, it's wet, so that would be my only hesitation. Like Liz mentioned earlier, having it to dry out that area is often one of the key things to stop the bacteria from getting in further. So that would just be my only hesitation: is it making the environment more wet rather than better? And I think a kind of more drying agent, which you get from the sprays, could be more beneficial.
Thank you.
See, we could have possibly been doing more harm than good with our lambs on the skull, running through the formalin 5 times. We've probably done more harm than we did good. We probably should have. It's difficult when you get a large amount in the group and they're going lame with scald. It's all, you know, all of a sudden it looks a mammoth job to tip everyone and spray its foot. Whereas a foot bath is a simple thing, isn't it, to run through, and you think you've done some good, and it took you 10 minutes, and you think you've cured the problem, but in fact we probably didn't. We probably caused more problems doing it. So it would be interesting to have some information or some work with scald and foot baths, wouldn't it?
And I think that's the hard thing with formalin, especially, is just that ratio, you know, having it that little bit too strong, you know, even inadvertently, isn't it? That can just do more damage. Really interested, because I did our lambs with it, and I thought you sometimes see them more lame for a bit and then they look better, but is that just me visually thinking that they are better? So it's really definitely opened a good discussion, I think, of is this going to be beneficial long term? And like you say, Chris, it's just that it is practicalities of it all, isn't it? And you feel you're doing good by everything being treated and kind of trying to sort and strengthen the horn as well, but is it as significant as we think it is?
Thanks, everyone. I've just got another question for you, Hayley. Could those ewes that were being housed and therefore the increased general bacteria levels in the shed, could that be a cause for the increase in lameness? And so could it have been worse if they weren't foot bathing? And did your chemicals suffer from any organic material contamination?
Yeah, so we do know that when you're housing ewes, it is quite a harsh environment for them to be in, and studies have found that lameness levels tend to be higher for those farmers that do house during lambing. So yes, I think that could be the foot bath, because we didn't have a control group that wasn't foot bathed at all, so we don't really know if it's the foot bath was protecting. So when the farmer stopped foot bathing right at the end because lambing had started, we did see a small increase in lameness levels, and at first I thought, oh, that's because maybe the foot bath was working as a preventative, but also at the same time, unfortunately, the farmer stopped other practices. So because he was so busy, he stopped. So he used to scrape where they were feeding and put lime down or move it, but he didn't have time to do that anymore. And he also used to layer up fresh straw once a week. He didn't have time to do that. So it looked like the foot bath may have had a protective effect, but actually, because other behaviours were also stopped at the same time, we don't truly know if that was the reason. But for the organic material, so yes, there was definitely organic material after they'd gone through the foot bath. It was completely brown. We emptied it, so we ran about between 150 and 200 sheep through before we emptied the foot bath, and then refilled it each time. And I'd say that really is the maximum for the size of footbath that we had. Really, it is important to keep looking at the level and checking that there is still solution in there. But yeah, there's definitely organic matter in there, and as you can see, it was still working with that organic matter, so the general bacteria population was still being killed even after 150 sheep had ran through.
Oh, brilliant, thank you. Sarah, do I have time for a couple more, or shall we move on for now?
I tell you what, if there's any final lameness questions, we've probably got time for just a couple more, and then we'll pass over to Liz.
Do we recommend an antibiotic for cod?
Yeah, we do. It is a difficult one to try and tackle. With that one, I found that your beta-moxil-A has been more beneficial. Again, it is a bit more farm specific, unfortunately, but that's the form of treatment that I have found to be most effective. It is a tricky one, unfortunately, to treat, and it's quite high up on my cull list if you do find it with a ewe, just because of its reinfection rate. Unfortunately, isolation is really key to try and minimise the spread, and I think that goes back to the quarantine really. It's the one that I really worry about, sheep bringing in onto a farm and causing kind of a devastating effect, unfortunately.
Thank you. And do you have any thoughts about using lincospectin for cod?
Yeah, that is another line for it. It's off license, so it's a bit difficult to advise, and with that one it would be to discuss more so with your vets on that basis.
And a final one for now. Is there sufficient evidence to suggest that housing on slats is better for lameness than straw?
Well, I'm just involved in a project actually over in Wales where they're looking at it. So it's a demonstration project on a farm down in South Wales where they've got some housed on slats, some on barley straw, some on wheat straw, some on sawdust, and some on some paper waste bedding. And so they are tracking lameness at the moment. There has the highest levels of lameness has been on the paper waste, I think, but it's 2 sheep out of 20 and it's only been running a couple of weeks. So I think it depends a bit on if those sheep are infected when they go onto slats, but obviously on slats there's less contact with the straw, and potentially the feet are drier, which helps as well. But again, we'll know a bit more once we finish the trial in a couple of weeks.
Oh, thanks, Liz. Will that be available online in a few weeks' time, or how should we find out?
Yeah. Oh, will be, yeah. It's through Farming Connect, so I can I can send it around. I'll put a tweet about it.
Brilliant, thanks.
Thanks, Chloe. Liz, you've got 5 minutes. So I'm now going to hand over to Liz, and she's going to tell us what the plans are for Chestnut Farm over the next couple of months to whet our appetites. 5 minutes.
Thanks.
Go.
Thanks, Sarah. So the big focus area that we're going to really look at is we've got some results from some soil tests. So we've done some nutrient levels. We've also done some soil biology work through an AHDB project. So we're sort of using that information to come up with a couple of trial fields where Chris is going to, on one of them, is going to spread half of it with DAP, so a phosphate nitrogen product, fertilizer product, and half with CalPhos. So again, they've been matched for the phosphate levels. And then we're going to track growth rates to see whether we can see which of those products did the best job in terms of helping raise the phosphate levels across quite a few of the fields. We've also got the infamous red clover field that caused loads of problems with ewe lamb performance that people may have heard on last call. The soil biology results actually showed quite low earthworm levels. It's also got lowish P and K levels. So we're targeting that with some sheep farmyard manure as well to see whether that can help build the earthworm activity and basically make that field behave a bit more normally. And as part of that sort of more in-depth work, we also looked at some forage samples, and it showed a slight reduction in salt, so sodium levels in grass. Again, we're going to try and apply some salt to those fields to try and improve palatability, and again see whether that can help sort of the grazing utilisation, which the rotational grazing is definitely helping, but could the salt help a bit more, I suppose. Chris is currently trying a slightly different feeding regime, so we're using silage fodder beet and some beans, molasses beans with a bit of mineral on them in the shed, again reducing the amount of concentrate being brought onto farm by using local beans that have been processed on farm. And as mentioned earlier, we're really excited to start looking at these herbal lays. They've been put in a field that's generally struggled from a dry perspective, so it's the ideal mixtures to go in. And so the mixtures, there's 4 of them being tested, and as Sarah mentioned, they've come from Germinal. So the main base one is perennial ryegrass, timothy, white clover, red clover, chicory and plantain, so sort of a standard, quite standard sort of multi-species sward. The next one has additional herbs in it. The next one, take the herbs out and replace it with a fesculolium, which is a hybrid of a fescue and a ryegrass. And the 4th one, instead of the fesculolium, has a tall fescue. So again, both of those grass species are renowned for their ability to deal with dry conditions. So again, we'll be monitoring that. It's more challenging to do with a plate meter just because of those different growth habits, but we'll be looking and tracking performance of those different mixes this sort of, when it finally dries up this season, to see whether that is an option for more fields of that at Chestnut Farm once we have that opportunity. So that's really the focus. So grass monitoring, as Chris mentioned, a bit more on looking at nutrients and trying to improve some of those very specific queries on some fields, and then looking at the performance of those herbal lays as we get onto them later in the spring.
Brilliant. Thank you, Liz. Chris, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think that's covered it, really. Trying to get the ewe lambs right as well. We're just going to try and really get them as best as we can. And then lambing will soon be here, yeah. So, yeah.
When do you start lambing, Chris?
23rd of February, the indoor lot, and then around the 1st of April, the outdoors, and then the 10th of April, the ewe lambs should start if they're in lamb.
Brilliant. So it's going to be a busy couple of months. Chloe, are there any final questions before we wrap up?
We've just got a couple. How would you treat a flock of growing lambs suffering from scald, which it seems to appear overnight?
And I would go in with topical spray because it's not appearing overnight. So and try and separate out lame ones.
One thing I would say is because we were weighing lambs every week, really, too much possibly, but what it did show is when they got scald, growth rates dropped incredibly. It really does hamper them, and they do stop and they go backwards very quickly. So it's something that really does bother them, and it does stop them growing, without a doubt.
Thanks, Chris. And just on the topic of sprays, will there be a risk with problems with resistance in the future using these sprays?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think potentially could always be the case with them. I think the good thing about them is it's not dose or weight dependent. So I think that's the biggest issue with certain resistance to antibiotics is your underdosing of that. So by it being topical, you're removing that element of it, really. So hopefully minimal in comparison to your injectable agents.
But it's still about using a product that's effective. So the challenge that we've discussed, which is we can suggest footbathing, but we don't know whether it's effective against that. A way of doing it is monitoring and seeing what happens in your lambs with how you do the footbathing. But I think it's just trying to prevent that spread within that group. So trying wherever possible to separate out lame ones.
Thanks both. I've got one here. It was mentioned earlier that some sheep can act as a reservoir for spread without showing symptoms. Is transmission from wounds in these reservoir animals, or is it just bacteria being active on the hoof itself?
Yeah, it's just. Oh, sorry.
No, go, Becca.
Oh no. Yeah, just the bacteria can live on the skin basically quite happily. It's until you get damage to the skin before it can access, and then that's where we have the effect. So there's a few more studies kind of on genetic kind of susceptibility carrier use, I suppose we would call them, that can have it on but not show any signs, unfortunately. And then, yeah, when conditions change or different stress factors kind of open up the skin in that area, then the bacteria goes in. So, yeah, very much so.
Thank you. And a final one. Do you have any views on using lime?
I'm guessing that's not a pH question. That's a prevention for lameness, so around water troughs.
Yeah, that'll be it. Yeah.
The lime one, the pH one's easy. So yeah, so the ambition is that it changes the pH within the foot, and so, but again, I don't know of any studies, and anecdotally people would do it, and I think it also helps dry out, so it also has a drying effect on the foot. But I don't know whether Hayley, you've seen any more work on it. Oh, she's on mute. We got all the way through without having to say it.
So close. Oh, it looks like Hayley's having some technical difficulties.
Oh,
Normally me.
I think you're unmuted now,
Yeah.
Hayley. Oh dear. Yeah, it says Hayley's unmuted, but I think her sound's gone, unfortunately.
Am I back now? Yes.
Oh yes.
No, so yeah, so I haven't seen any particular research on using lime, but the farm I was working with used lime when they so where the actual sheep were eating, a lot of the time they would obviously defecate where they're eating, and they'd scrape that and then use lime, and it was more of a drying effect, so it really did help to kind of quickly dry out that area. But no, I've not seen any specific research on lime, unfortunately.
Thank you, Hayley. I think that's us for this evening.
Lovely. Thank you, Chloe. So just to finish, just to remind you that we have a huge number of resources and tools available on the website, a lot to do with reducing lameness. So manuals to particularly look out for include the Reducing Lameness for Better Returns, which can be found in the Knowledge Library on the website. We also have a number of webinars and videos to watch on our YouTube channel as well. We even have a whole series on lameness, so plenty to have a look at there. This webinar will also be recorded and will be posted on the YouTube channel over the next couple of days, so if you want to listen back to it, you can. So it's my job to bring the meeting to a close. I would firstly like to thank our brilliant speakers for their input into tonight's discussion. So thank you to Chris, to Liz, to Becca and Hayley. And also thank you to my colleague Chloe for assisting me tonight, ensuring that there were no technical glitches and all your questions were answered. And finally, a big thank you to everyone who has been listening. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, and also a big thank you for asking so many questions as well. It really does make the meeting. When the webinar ends, you will be taken to a survey. Please do, if you can, provide some feedback. It really helps us tailor these events to your needs. So without further ado, thank you very much and have a lovely evening.